Welcome to Teatime Tales. I am your storyteller, Owen Pilgrim, and today I have a story for you from Japan. It's called The Wisp of Straw. Once there was a poor man. He had nothing. He had no friends, no family, no home, no work, nothing at all, and he was fed up with it. He said to himself, I must find my fortune, or else there's nothing worth living for in the world. And so he went to a temple, and he prayed for a sign that might show him how to get his fortune. And nothing came immediately, so he stayed at the temple. And this started to bother the monks because they had to feed him every day. And eventually they said, look, you're going to have to leave, but you may stay for one more night. And so the poor man went to sleep that night, and he had a dream. And in his dream, a voice told him to keep the last thing his hand would grasp on his way out of the temple. And so the next day he remembered his dream, and he was leaving the temple and thinking about what it might be he would grasp in his hand. And he wasn't really paying attention as he went down the steps, and he tripped and he fell onto the ground. But on his way down, something was grasped in his hand. And when he sat up, he opened his hand to find that he'd held a wisp of straw, just a thin wisp of straw. And he thought, well, this is a very strange thing that might lead me to my fortune, but the dream told me to keep it, and so I will. So he held on to that wisp of straw, and he made his way down the road. And as he was walking down the road, the sun came up, and it got very hot. And a dragonfly began to fly around the poor man. And when it landed on him, the poor man caught it. And he had an idea. And he took the end of the wisp of straw and he tied it around the dragonfly's neck like a leash. And he had it on the end of the wisp of straw flying around as he continued to walk down the road. And here he was walking down the road with this dragonfly fluttering about his head when a carriage came past. And in that carriage was a little boy. A little boy who was a little bit spoiled. And he saw the dragonfly flying around on the leash. And the little boy said, I want that for myself. And this little boy was used to getting what he wanted. And so it was called from the carriage, excuse me, may we have that dragonfly? And when the poor man saw it was for a little boy, he said, of course, here you go, and handed it over. And the little boy took it, and he had a big smile on his face. Now also in the carriage were the little boy's older sisters, all dressed in elegant clothes. And they said, well, we must give you something. And so they found 3 juicy oranges wrapped in paper and a packet of tea. And they handed it over to the poor man. And they said, here you go, take those for indulging the little boy. And off they went. Now you'll be happy to know that after a few minutes, the little boy got bored of the dragonfly and they set it free. But the poor man continued on, and he was thinking how lucky he was that the wisp of straw had already turned into 3 oranges and a packet of tea. And off he went. Now the road led up into the hills, and the sun was beating down. It was a very hot day, and he hadn't really brought anything to drink, and he was starting to get very thirsty, when he saw a woman, a lady, walking up the road with her servant holding a parasol over her. And she was dressed in travelling clothes and obviously was on her way somewhere. But she was very hot, and the sun was drying her out, and she was thirsty. And as the poor man walked past, the woman collapsed onto the ground. And the servant said to the poor man, do you have any water we can give to her? She might die up here. And the poor man said, oh no, I don't have any water, but I do have juicy oranges. So he took out one of the juicy oranges and unwrapped it and peeled it and gave it to the servant, who squeezed it into the lady's mouth. And she began to suck at it, and soon she woke up and was a little bit revived. And so the poor man took out his other 2 oranges and peeled them and fed them to the lady until she felt much better. And she sat there with a parasol held over her head while she started to feel better. Now she had horses and supplies with her, but they hadn't caught up yet. And so she said to the poor man, "Now you wait here with me and have a meal before you go on. Why, you may have just saved my life." And so the poor man stayed until finally the horses and servants caught up, and the lady gave them a good scolding for falling so far behind. And a meal was prepared. It was simple, but very gratifying, and it filled up the poor man. Meanwhile, some of the other servants had gone to fetch water, and they brought it back, and they boiled the kettle, and the poor man offered up his tea. So a fine pot of tea was brewed, and it was very refreshing, and everybody felt much better afterwards, and ready to be on their way. But before the poor man set off, the lady said, "Now listen, I must give you something. Here, take these 3 rolls of fine white cloth." And she gave them to the poor man. And off he went, feeling very lucky indeed. Why, his wisp of straw had now become 3 fine rolls of white cloth. And so he went off down the road. And he walked until finally he started to come into a forest. And as he was walking through that forest, there came some horses. And at the front was a gentleman riding a strong, well-bred steed. But the horse stumbled and fell onto the ground. The poor man looked at it and thought it must have been dehydrated from the hot day and wasn't feeling very well. And the gentleman got off and he looked at the horse, his favourite horse, and he said, "I don't think this horse is going to survive. It's going to die here." And he ordered his servants to take off the saddle and the bridle and put them on another horse so he could be on their way. And he said to a servant, he said, "You stay here and get rid of that horse." And the gentleman went off. And the poor man had watched all this happen. Now the servant was left there with the horse and had no idea what to do with it. And the poor man thought, well, maybe this is some of my luck happening right now. And he said to the servant, he said, "Here, I'll give you one of these rolls of fine white cloth if you'll give me that horse." Well, the servant was happy to be rid of the horse. So he said, fine. He took the cloth and off he went. Now the poor man, he set to work. He found a well nearby and he brought water back for the horse. And he washed the horse's body and he put water into its mouth and he rubbed its head. And he did this over and over again until the horse started to sit up a bit. And he kept doing this, bringing water to the horse, until the horse finally stood up and looked much better. But it obviously needed rest. So the poor man and the horse got beneath a tree and they fell asleep together for the night. And when they woke up in the morning, they both went to drink a deep draught from the well, and they both felt completely fine. So they went into the village nearby, and the poor man traded the last 2 rolls of fine white cloth for a saddle and bridle and some hay for the horse. And off they went down the road. And the poor man felt very lucky indeed. Why, the wisp of straw had now become a horse. But the poor man also realized that he still looked like a poor man. And if he was caught riding this fine steed, they might think he'd stolen it. So it'd be better if he sold it as quick as he could. So off he went. And he came to the edge of a town. And there he passed a number of houses with farmland and rice fields around them. And he saw outside one of the houses, there was a nobleman, packing up, getting a cart ready and many horses for what looked like a long journey. The poor man thought, I wonder if he needs one more horse. So over he went, And he said to the nobleman, "Excuse me, would you be looking for a horse? Because I happen to have this one for sale." And the nobleman looked and he said, "Well, that is a fine, well-bred horse indeed, and it just so happens I am looking for another horse." And the poor man said, "Well, if you're willing to give me silk and some money, you may have it." Said the nobleman. "Well, I've no silk and I need all the money I have because I'm going on a long journey to the west." He said, "But let me try it out." And so the nobleman got onto the horse and took it for a ride along the hillside and back again. And he was sure he'd never ridden such an incredible horse in his life. And he said, "I'll tell you what, poor man, I'll give you one of my rice fields in exchange for the horse." The poor man said, "Well, you know, I don't really know how to farm rice, and I really could do with the money." Well, the nobleman thought about this, and he said, "I'll tell you what, I'm going on a very long journey, and I'm sure to be gone for years. You may have my house, with all the rice fields, and my servants, and the farmers as well. The servants will take care of you, the farmers will work the rice fields, and whatever profit is made is yours. How about that?" Well, this was a deal that the poor man could not turn down, so he agreed. They went inside, and the nobleman drew up papers declaring that the land and the fields would all belong to the poor man until the nobleman returned. And then, once he finished preparations, he set off with his horses and his carts and some of his servants on his journey to the west. And the poor man settled in to this beautiful house in the countryside. The servants, they were there to take care of him, and the farmers worked the fields. And he stayed there. And it turned out he was very talented at managing the land. And all the servants and the farmers loved him because he knew how to take care of them. And eventually he got married and had a family. And it turned out that the nobleman never returned. And so the land and the house belonged to the poor man. And he stayed there and was very wealthy for the rest of his days. And he always delighted in telling the story of how a wisp of straw turned into his fortune. And that is the story. Thank you for joining me here on Teatime Tales, presented by the Telltale Tea Company.